All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Once again, thanks for joining us today. My name is Nicole Caban. Before we get started real quick, I just want to talk a little bit about the Florida Literacy Coalition. We are a statewide umbrella literacy organization, and we're the host of Florida's Adult and Family Literacy Resource Center. FLC provides a range of services to support more than 300 adult education, literacy, and family literacy providers throughout Florida. And we place special emphasis on assisting community-based literacy organizations with their training and program development needs. We'd also like to thank the Florida Department of Education for supporting this webinar and their continued support of adult education in Florida. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about your webinar tools. So if you look on your control panel, which is going to be on the right-hand side of your screen, if you see a red arrow on the left-hand side, if you press that button, it will dock your control panel so you just see your screen. If you press it again, it'll bring it back out. Underneath that, you should see a little hand icon. That hand icon is a hand raise feature, so if prompted at any point during the webinar, you'll press that little button to raise your hand. On your actual control panel, you'll see a questions box. A lot of you are already using it, but that questions box, if you type something in, I will see it and Jamie will see it, and one of us will answer your question. Also, there's a poll feature, so at a couple of times throughout the webinar, you will be asked to participate in a poll. So the poll will show up on your screen, and you could just choose from the multiple choice answers, and then everyone will be able to see the answers in a percentage format. I'm joined today by Jamie Allison Goldstein, and Jamie has been active in the adult ESOL field for the last 35 years, teaching, developing materials, and delivering professional development across the U.S. and overseas. This year, one of her favorite projects, ESOL Pro, has allowed her to collaborate with members of Florida's ESOL community and to extend contextualization for work and career pathways into all levels of ESOL. She's also working on the 3rd edition of the Oxford Picture Dictionary. This is her 5th webinar with the Florida Literacy Coalition, and we are thrilled to have her back. So I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Jamie. Jamie, you're still muted, by the way.
Yes, I know, and Jamie was trying to unmute, but having a little problem. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm just going to get my screen up here appropriately. Nicole, it looks like I can't. Ah, there we go. Thank you for your patience, everybody. This is always a fun time just trying to get everything about right. Here we go. Hopefully we're going to show soon. There we go. So this is a much more attractive image of me. I aim to look like my emoticon in the days ahead. I want to encourage you to use the chat pod as well as the questions so that it's possible for everyone to see what your comments are. If you have a question you want to ask me or you want to make sure gets answered, putting it in the question area is a great idea because Nicole will monitor that as well. I wanted to share a little bit about my writing journey with you. The other day I found this piece that is my 10-year-old writing, and I thought it was quite poignant that what I would most like to capture is time at 10, and it hasn't changed at 60. And then the question about if you managed to trap it, how long would it remain the way you want it to be? At 10, I was wise enough to say, not very long, I'm sad to say. But I have had an experience as a writer that really has influenced how I teach writing as an English language teacher and how I want to help other teachers. It is evidence-based, and we'll be referencing a lot of the evidence throughout this webinar. I think it's important to note that even at 60, I still get quite excited at the conclusion of a single paragraph. And my husband has been known to, try to temper my response, but I still go for the confetti. So now a bit about you. I'm going to ask you to complete a poll. We're going to be doing things in the chat area and in the poll to keep this to make sure that you're as involved as possible. I know that webinars are a great time for multitasking. I have ironed and cleaned out drawers many a time while doing a webinar, and you are more than welcome to engage in those left brain activities while your right brain soaks in all the information. But let's take a poll. I'm trying to take a poll. Let's see. And I'm going to launch this poll. This is all new. Great. And if you would, please select how you feel about teaching writing. You have 5 choices. You might have another choice in there, and if there's another choice you wanted to speak up to, you can write it in your chat area. At the moment, we are 25 attendees, so I'm going to watch the poll and get a sense of how many people are responding, and then I'll close the poll in about 15 seconds or so. Okay, it looks like about 95% of us voted, which is a pretty good turnout. I'm going to close the poll now. Nicole, that's what I do, right? I close and then I share. I'm hoping that's what I do.
Yes.
Excellent. So we can see that we have a lot of affection, but not passion for teaching writing. About 14% of us are passionate, and it looks like we have some areas where it might help if the learners were a little more enthusiastic, or whether if we were maybe a little more confident. So hopefully this is something we'll be addressing as we move forward. Let's go to one more poll, because it's all about you. So I'll give you a minute to look at these. Which of the following statements is most true for you? And it could be that again, this doesn't exactly identify your situation, but let's answer it to the best of your ability. And I'm going for that at least 95% rate, but I'd like to get it up to 98. Let's give it a shot. And the rationale for this poll is so that I know a little bit about who you're teaching. It gives me a little better picture so that when I'm addressing you out there from California to Florida. Okay, we're at 83%. We're moving on. And it looks like the majority of you are working in ESOL, which is terrific because that is the focus. So let me share the results with you. While what we're talking about absolutely addresses all writers, new writers, experienced writers, writers writing in their first language, writers writing in a second, third, or fourth language, what we're going to focus on in this webinar are in particular some of the strategies we need for the new writer in English, and then in general the types of writing tools that good writers need to make use of. Now this very last one is not a poll in the polling sense. It is that I want you to actually write in the chat area. So you should see a little box that says chat, and I just want you to write down the abbreviations that represent the learners that you have in your class. So some of you who have multi-level classes are going to put down more than one. So if you would right now, just take 1 minute, I'll time it.
Jamie?
Yes?
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I just want to stop you. I actually don't think they can see a chat box.
Oh, well then.
I want to just make sure that what I'm saying is true. Can you raise your hands, press the little hand raise icon if you cannot see a chat box. Hold on.
This is for cannot, right? Cannot.
Right. Okay, so, or you can't type into it anyway.
Okay. Well, then we're just going to ignore this poll. And what we'll do is go through, and as I go through, if you have a question, so this means that we're just going to make use of the question area. If you have a question about how this would apply to your level, please feel free to type that question in. And Nicole, I just want to let you know that I have everything up, but for some reason the question window is not visible for me. So I will be asking for your help with that.
Sure, not a problem.
Thanks. All right, well, let's move on to see how we'll be spending our time. We're going to be going together through a number of different tasks and activity types. Some of the first things we'll be doing is looking at ways to help learners delve into topics. We'll consider ways that learners can work with vocabulary and build their academic language. We'll explore tools that help learners organize their thoughts and their writing. And by the end of our time together, it's my hope that you'll be able to identify a variety of writing tasks and topics for your learners, integrate the writing process elements into your writing lessons, and implement feedback and editing tips, which are actually one of the best ways to provide some direct instruction, personalized, customized direct instruction to learners, as opposed to the larger picture where you're showing models and frames, which is very important, but the one-to-one with you and the learner is also quite key. Just take a second and think about which of those three is most important to you. And then I want to give you some time to write your own questions and concerns. So if you want to take a moment now just to type any questions you have that you want me to address in the next 75 minutes or so, that would be terrific. You also can write those questions as we go along. And I'm just going to take a moment and see if I can see that question box. There we go. I have it now.
Okay, good.
And I see that one of the questions that Nancy has asked, and it's a very, very critical question for all of us, is how can she make time to work with students one-to-one when she has 25 students in the class? What are the other students doing? And what happens, Nancy, is that we use tools like checklists, or we can do writer conferences where learners are sitting in pairs and they're working together, and we call a pair of learners at a time up to the desk. There are a lot of ways to manage that, and I will be chatting about that throughout. So let's move forward. I have one more poll for you because this really addresses what it is we need to think about for learners in terms of what do adults write. So here are 5 writing tasks. Take a look at them, and of these 5, which do you do most often? One of the great things about working with adult learners is that as adults, we can really identify relevance and motivating tasks because we know what it is we need to do. Of course, our populations often have challenges that we may not. So it's important for us to be aware of, issues with landlords that we may not have, or workplace scenarios that we may not encounter. So we have to expand our understanding, but we also know what the most common types of writing tasks are in daily life. So it looks like we've only had 70%. We're going down here. Come on. We've got 5 more seconds to get the rest of you voting. I made a little difference in the voting by my encouraging words. All right, I want to see 90%. I won't close it until we have 90%. Wouldn't that be something if the country worked that way? All right, I'm lying. I'm closing it at 85. So here's what it looks like. And I think this is a very telling situation. Now, I actually have to write a number of reports in my work. So I would have probably put that as a number 3 if I were ranking this. I probably write more business emails than I write social emails, but that's very specific to my workplace. Look at what we do. We primarily are writing emails. That's what we see here. So that's something for us to consider when we are helping our learners write. What's going to be something that they're going to really need to do if they're going to advance? Certainly in college and career readiness level, they're going to need to be able to write emails. So we need to put that in as some of as the basis of some of our writing lessons. However, we also have to be aware that I didn't ask what the age group that we have here, but I would imagine that a lot more of our learners that are under 30 would be clicking on E more than some of us might be. So an awareness of people using social media and how they write on social media is very important. And social media is being used more and more in academic settings. So it's important for learners to know how to write appropriately on Facebook pages that are set up by their professors. Okay. Now, if you were thinking of a list, I've skipped a slide, so that would be what would you think your students would write? But if you were thinking of a list that your learners would need to write, I would imagine that many of these things would come into it. And this is how we would really start, by thinking about what is the purpose for writing. And from the purpose comes the lesson. So we want to think of purpose and theme, and then the topic comes out of that. When you think about good writing, what is it that you think about? What skills come up to mind? Writing is such a complex act that high-quality writing relies on a large constellation of skills and abilities. If you have not seen the Teal Just Write Guide, and I have a link here, but the link you can pick up in the handout, or if you just Google Teal Just Write, you'll get the PDF. This is a very, very rich resource, and it not only provides lots and lots of evidence-based suggestions for effective writing, it also talks about the research that informs what we need to do because of what we know about good writers. So here are some key skills and strategies that the good writer employs. Look through those and think, when you go to write, how easy is it for you to do these things? And how difficult is it for our learners? I see that one of the questions that came up from Trevin is, how can Trevin help students master the style of English which is more direct than the learner's native language? And this is very important in terms of organizing content. This is actually how we we help learners is we provide direct instruction in how to organize their ideas in the style that is most typical for compare and contrast or description or a linear type of narrative. These other skills and strategies are a little more general, but they really work in terms of the cognitive process. How do learners generate ideas? Where do those ideas come from? How are they inspired to write? This is a big issue for a lot of our learners. How can they evaluate whether an idea is really worth spending time writing? How can they synthesize ideas effectively? This is huge with plagiarism. So how do they know how to work with multiple texts and multiple ideas without copying what it is they're reading and doing the synthesis? And then I think really critical is the idea that there is no good writing without reading. There is no writing instruction without reading instruction. Learners need to read extensively and closely in order to be able to write well. This doing research and the ability to edit, these are very high-level skills for academic and career readiness. So these are the skills and strategies that we need to include in our teaching. I'd like to share this quote with you. I think it's one of the finer quotes about writing. I'll read it aloud in case any of you are having any difficulty reading it. Learning to write in a second language is not simply the accrual of technical linguistic abilities, but rather is intimately related to identity, how one sees oneself and is seen by others as a student, as a writer, and as an ethno-linguistic minority. So helping our learners express that identity as a writer is so critical and is so liberating to the learner. Something else to consider is that effective writers also plan, monitor, evaluate, and revise their writing. In other words, the writing process. But in addition to participating in the writing process, they know how to manage that process. So especially in teaching English learners, we need to really take that writing process and break it down for the learners and help them identify where should they be spending most of their time. And certainly at the lower level, we're going to spend the majority of our time in pre-writing. And at the higher level, we're going to be spending a lot of time in revision. So these things are important for the learners to know, to recognize where they're going to have to invest the most time and energy as they're writing. Now, one of the ways that we can make this happen really effectively is to target instruction for our learners. We need to know what they can and can't do. So get them to write a writing sample. It doesn't matter how they spell. It doesn't matter whether they use punctuation. You just want to see something that gives you an idea of how or if they can write. Obviously, if we're talking about a beginning literacy student who cannot write, then the writing sample becomes a language experience activity. And we see maybe how they think about what they're seeing or doing. But you would ask students to perhaps describe a photo, a cartoon, or an illustration. You can pull it out of your textbook. You could have them read a very short text, even a conversation, in the first couple of weeks. I would actually do it in the first couple of sessions, and have them respond to a writing prompt about what they read. Or they can write a process, something that they know inside out how to do. Now, all of these will probably take some amount of coaching ahead of time and possibly some modeling, but not a lot, because you really want to see what it is that the learner can already do. But make sure that you give them time to plan and think so that you can see also what kind of planning. Do they have any kind of graphic organizer familiarity? Would they maybe list things? So this is really, really important. You need to know your learner. You also need to start with the end in mind. We know this from the evidence on effective instruction. So even though you know, oh, my learners need to write an essay, which is something we'll be talking about with the Florida Literacy Adult Essay book, but you know they want to write an essay, or you want them to write an essay, or you know that a summary is part of the curriculum, but you need to think about what it is they're going to write about and what's that final product meant to look like. And you can see that it goes as simply as going to a list. We can go with, beginning level learners, they maybe just need to write a list of places they can study, or foods that are healthy. I mean, it's just, we're not talking about necessarily writing the Declaration of Independence. We're just talking about getting the students to write. And in order to do this really effectively, we need an explicit, direct, and systematic approach. And this is where the evidence is leading us. We want to be explicit in the goals of the writing. We want to be direct in our instruction of strategies. We're not just showing things and letting the ideas float over the learner. We're actually explaining what it is the writer in a text is doing to help the reader understand the goal of that writing. And then our process is systematic. We are using a writing process because that cycle of writing is something that learners need to use no matter what they're working on. And then we really need to increase our learners' comfort level in writing. Some of you mentioned that you'd like writing more, instructing writing more, if your students enjoyed writing more. And that's a very important part of this process. I have worked with learners and teachers of learners who hated to read. And we had to build in an affection for reading. And how do we do that? Through the motivation that what that task is going to do is going to be worthy for that student. It's going to be relevant for that student. So having learners do quick writes, none of these things, with the exception of the status updates on social media, none of these 4 things require you to grade or correct grammar. They're an opportunity for the learner to get his or her thoughts out in writing. And they can also use drawing at the lower levels. They can use symbols. They can actually, if they don't have a word, they can use their own language to put in the word and then later look the word up. But a quick write is giving students a minute to write on something, or sometimes 2 minutes. Back and forth journals is just giving the students a piece of paper, and they go back and forth either with you or with a peer. And it can be on any topic. It can just be a simple question. What was the best thing that happened to you yesterday? Favorites, simple types of questions initially, so that one student writes and then they exchange their papers. Both students write, they exchange their papers, and they respond to what the other person wrote. Quick polls, kind of like quick writes, but you give the student a frame. I agree, I disagree, because. And exit tickets. Could I have a show of hands? Let's see if I can get my attendees to open up. Would you raise your hand if you have used exit tickets? I can see that some of you have, and that's terrific. So exit tickets allow the learners to tell you what it is they learned or a question they have at the end of the class. I use Post-it notes, and I have 2 areas. Since I primarily work with teachers, I still get exit tickets that are very robust, and I have an area for where the teacher can post, where my learner can post the questions he or she has, and another area where the learner can post comments. So sometimes they can use different color Post-its. But this is a great way for learners to they get used to the idea of writing. And again, remember, no grammatical feedback required. Now let me just take a moment and talk about status updates or posts on Facebook. There are a lot of great pages on Facebook, including the Florida Literacy Coalition's Facebook page. And we can identify a Facebook page that's in an area of interest to the students, and students can post an update or post a question. And for those situations where the published work is very public, it would be nice to provide some feedback for learners on accuracy. because that's their public face. But I do want to encourage you to make use of social media. Now, highlighting the process as well as the product comes from how we provide formative assessment. So we're not just looking at the product at the very end, but we're looking at it all the way through. And using checklists or rubrics, as are shown here, is a very important entree for students to see that it's a process. Writing is not one and none. It's very important to have that sloppy copy, to have a conversation with your peer, to come back and re-examine what you've written. That whole go back and write some more, which some people are not as fond of. My mother used to tear up my papers and make me go back. It was really harsh. But it built character. So maybe you don't tear up their papers. But how we can help our learners acquire and apply the strategies that I showed you earlier is learning what they know and can do, starting with the end in mind, providing explicit and systematic instruction, providing lots and lots of practice. We need learners to do a lot of writing, much like we need learners to do a lot of reading. And of course, we need a lot of listening and speaking. So we're going to think about how do we integrate all those 4 skills in our sessions and provide formative assessment feedback along the way. So let me ask you, what do you already know about the writing process? Yes, it's another poll. All right, I see that we have a healthy number who know about it. We've got about 2/3 of our group voting. Keep it up. How about another 10 seconds? See if I can get the rest of you to vote. I do feel like I should do cheerleading. It's a click, people. It's not rocket science. Okay, that's a minute. I'm going to close it at a minute. I think this will give us a general view. So we have about half our group that knows and uses the writing process in class. Yes! And another healthy chunk, I don't think you have a chunk of people, but a healthy selection that has that knows about the process. We have a few that may have heard of it or have simply heard about it and maybe are not making use of it right now. But no one said that they have not heard of it. So that is, I think that might be a double negative. But that's terrific. So this is going to be review and we'll move through it fairly quickly. The writing process, just to remind you, starts with pre-writing and moves to drafting. The drafting moves to feedback, but the feedback can go back to drafting, or it can go on to revising. Revising goes to more feedback, or it could go and then goes back to revising. So you see the cyclical concept here. Additional feedback goes to editing and finalizing, and the last stage is publishing. Now, in some cases, we actually just go here, and that would be our quick writes. It would be opportunities where we just want the learner to write, get practice with writing, and we will still probably give some feedback, but it'll be based on content more than structure. Where we're going with this is actually a writing task that we want the learner to be able to say, it's gone through the process, this stands for what I wanted to write. And there are a lot of different projects. There are smaller projects like writing a business email, writing a request. There are longer things such as essays. And the concept that I most want you to think about here is how much time this takes. Because we need to be aware, and we need to help our learners be aware that yes, we can actually do the writing process approach and just stick with pre-writing and drafting and let that be the time we spend. But if we want to get to finalizing and publishing, then we are talking about a number of opportunities to write and more time in class. Just checking to see if there are any questions. So let's start with pre-writing, because this is actually the stage where, unless we do this stage, both explicitly and systematically, we're going to have many more difficulties when we get to the drafting. Learners won't have ideas, or their organization will be problematic, and certainly more issues when we get to the revising stage. So the pre-writing focus is on the topic the learner's choosing, the way that he or she is working with ideas, the vocabulary, the word choice that learners will have available to them, and the organization of the writing. When you're selecting a topic, and very often you're the one as the instructor that is selecting the topic, you want to think about how motivating is this topic to the author, aka the student. How motivating would it be to the reader? Is the topic well known, or will it require research? A lot of times we have to build our learner's schema around a topic that's in a textbook. It may not be the topic that the learner is most familiar with, but that's a great learning opportunity. Excuse me. And then the other thing to be aware of, since we know that reading and writing go hand in hand, is what level appropriate texts are available on that topic, so that I can have something for learners that I can prime them with. And when I say text, I actually extend text out to be video, audio, images, all of the input that a learner could make use of before he or she sits down to write. Now, here are some topics from a book that you probably know and love very well. Several of you were able to complete the survey that I sent out earlier, and it was a small part of the demographic because the link went out a little late, but I did see that many of those of you who responded have already participated or have learners who have participated, so that's terrific. Looking at this list of your experience, looking at this list of topics, when you look at this and think about your learners, which of these topics would match the criteria of being relevant and motivating for the author? Which of these topics would be very challenging for your learners to write about because of the vocabulary load that they would have to have, the amount of vocabulary that they would have to have in order to write effectively about it? My answers to those questions, because unfortunately we can't chat about that, would be that I think that favorites are pretty motivating, because learners may not have favorites, but if they do, then it's a pretty motivating topic. I think that comparing where they were born to where they're currently living, or comparing anything, is actually something that learners like to do, because it comes along with evaluating. Now, that could also have a very high vocabulary load, so you would need to support the learner in that. The American Dream, that would be a wonderful topic, but probably more appropriate to a higher level learner because of the need to do research on what the American Dream is and to be able to contrast that. Possibly An Encounter That Changed My Life might also be something that would require a bit higher level. But again, using, and we'll see this in a moment, using frames and models, learners might be able to tackle all of these topics. But it's important for you as the instructor to think about how much instruction would need to go on to support the learner to write about this topic. Note also that more generally, The Florida Literacy Coalition essay book includes original poetry and personal stories. And certainly original poetry, and I highly recommend looking up pattern poems in Google, and you'll find some wonderful, wonderful frames of poetry that learners can write. There are also several examples of those in the 2015 book. And that's a wonderful way for learners to participate in this and also work with a variety of topics that are personal and customized to them. When you're thinking about the topics, you want to identify the context or the purpose of the writing task. Certain topics, of course, don't lend themselves to certain tasks. So what kind of emails do our learners need to write? What kind of lists would our learners really make? What kind of paragraph would be most meaningful for a learner to write so that he or she could then use that in other settings? When we get down to this last one about a multi-paragraph composition, in this case, we're really talking about the potential of research. I've had students do this in a writing program. I've had them do it based on their own opinions. But now with college and career readiness, what we really want them to do is look at other people's opinions in text and compare those. So that's a pretty academic task, and we'd want to think about which learners would be most interested in doing that. And we can actually do this with listing, with a T-chart, so it doesn't have to go all the way up to multi-paragraph composition for this topic. But when we're thinking about the writing task, which is to eventually get our learners to write multi-paragraph compositions, certainly by high intermediate level, that's something we're looking for, then we want to think about what topics really go well for that type of task. I wanted to also give you a view of multi-level writing objectives. I know some of you are teaching in classes where you have learners at different proficiency levels. You want to try to stay with the same theme. You want to try to be able to do your pre-writing work with the whole class, but then you will adjust the writing task to match the writing level of your learners. So if I decided that learners are going to write a short narrative about the day they arrived in the U.S., that's the general objective, at my literacy level, the learners are going to be dictating words, phrases, or sentences to me about the day they arrived. Or they might be just doing it about a picture that they would see, so maybe it wouldn't be their personal story. At the beginning level, they're going to complete 3 to 5 sentences about the day they arrived, and they're going to have the support of word lists and sentence frames or prompts. At the intermediate level, they're going to use a model and write 1 or more paragraphs about their arrival. And at the advanced level, they're just going to increase their writing, but still making use of the model and prompts, and maybe contrast, this is an additional, more academic task, contrast their arrival with the arrival of an immigrant at another time. Just checking my question pod to see if any of you have any questions. Feel free to write questions as we go along. So that's getting ready with the end in mind. So the pre-writing stage, I need to have an idea of where it is the learners are going. So I want to be aware of what the topic's going to be, and I want to be aware of what the requirements of the task will be so that I can arrange my pre-writing work in my lesson appropriately. And one of the ways that one of the things I know that I'm going to need to do with the learners is build their schema or review the information in the topic. And I can do that with using picture stories. I can have the learners draw. I can have them survey or interview each other, or bring a guest speaker in and have them interview him or her. And I can use language experience tasks or stories. Let's take a look at those. And I can have them read. Again, reading and writing inextricably woven together. So if I'm going to use picture stories, I'm going to help learners through the picture story identify the topic that we're writing on, and also maybe build in a little of the organization through sequencing. So in this case, this is a story about an emergency. So let's say that I was going to have students write a a narrative, or draw and label at a very low level a narrative about a medical situation that they had. And in this case, you can see this picture story. This comes from Kayla's health. There's a website with picture stories on health situations, and I have the link here that you'll pick up through the handout. If you have the learners draw, that's a great pre-writing activity, especially at low level, but it also works at higher level, having them write a story, make a storyboard, especially if they're doing a process paragraph, to give them time to plan and think about what goes into that process. And they can use symbols, or they can use their cartooning skills, or they could, use words and images. They don't have to be Picasso, or maybe they want to be Picasso, and maybe not Renoir. But this piece that I have, this link that I have at the bottom, you can see the title at the end, Why Drawing Belongs in the Adult ESOL Classroom. This is a great article about the evidence that shows how drawing helps not all learning styles, but certainly helps a number of our learners who may be more visual than verbal, and it helps them grease the wheels of their thinking and their writing. When learners survey or interview each other or a guest speaker, this is a great opportunity to use the pre-writing period to build learners' oral skills, to help them build their fluency in oral communication. You can provide the questions, but for example, if we were going to write about a favorite place, which is one of the essays for the Florida Literacy Coalition, learners could be asking and answering questions about places they've been, favorite places, what makes it a favorite place, and in that process of talking about the topic, they're again getting kind of juiced up. And the language experience approach is also a wonderful precursor to writing. Now, the language experience approach takes two forms. You can have students write about a picture, and by write, I mean dictate what they see in the picture. Or you can provide an experience for learners and have them dictate to you what that experience was. And in language experience, you are not correcting grammar. You're taking the language of the learners exactly as they say it to you, but you do give the learners an opportunity to edit or change once they see the completed work. But this is a very nice collaborative process that helps learners work, and there's a lot of evidence that says collaborative writing is initially very reassuring to the language learner, but it helps them work together before they work individually. Now, the other aspect of pre-writing that is very important to focus on is the building of learners' vocabulary. And obviously, at the lowest level with our learners, we're not going to focus so much on the precise language. We are going to want to introduce some of that, but we want to first get the more general language. But as we move into the intermediate level, we really want to be thinking about helping learners work with more precise versions of the term. So good, important, these are words that have a variety of shades of meaning when we go to the precise vocabulary. So we want to make that available to learners. We also want to help learners start to tackle academic vocabulary, but the academic word list doesn't mean that it's content vocabulary or domain specific. The academic word list are words that are found throughout academic texts across disciplines. And when you learn an academic word, you can learn its whole family. So here you go. Here's the word accurate. I want you to take a moment and jot down all the words you think that are in the word family of accurate. You don't have to write it on the question pod. Just write it on a piece of paper or hum to yourself and think about it. I should be playing the Jeopardy theme song. Did you get any of these? Accurate is an important word for learners to hear. It's better than the word than saying something is wrong. Saying it's inaccurate, especially with grammar, is very nice. The idea of the idea of writing accurately versus writing fluently, these are concepts that certainly at the intermediate level we want to introduce. So when we're talking to learners about learning English, we want them to be able to value accuracy and fluency and not put one over the other. And that's a great word. And that's something that learners can certainly tackle at all levels. So the academic word list is not something that we have to keep away from our learners. And certainly if we're working on more college and career ready types of writing, summaries, for example, or stating opinions or stating evidence according to, these are our standard phrases that we can introduce even at the beginning level, depending on what it is we're writing about. Now, one of the things that I really think is important is to introduce a variety of vocabulary learning strategies, or VLS. And vocabulary learning strategies run through 5 different domains. You have the determination strategy, which is really about looking it up or analyzing the word. You have the social strategy, which I show you here. You have the mnemonic strategy, which is where you create an image in your mind, or you somehow create a memory tool to recall the word. And mnemonics tend to be more about remembering than getting the meaning. Social and determination are more about getting the meaning. After mnemonic, you have the cognitive and metacognitive strategies, and those two are really about holding the meaning of the word. Cognitive is more how you practice. Metacognitive is how you self-direct your vocabulary learning. Are you looking, are the learners looking at TV programs? Are they listening to podcasts? Are they making flashcards? Are they taking on the vocabulary learning or any type of learning in a self-directed way? And that's the more metacognitive. But for today, we're just focusing on this social vocabulary learning strategy, which is to create a list of words that they might want to make use of in their writing, depending on the topic, and then have them work with a partner after they've determined whether they use the word or whether they know it, and determining which words need to be looked up. It's a great way of limiting what it is you're teaching. And then to, I think it was Trevin's question about the organization. We have to help our learners organize their ideas, and one of the ways to do that is to make use of graphic organizers and models. So if a learner read something contrasting one student's country and the US, they could take that reading and put the information in a Venn diagram. That would help them categorize the information and see how it's organized. You can use a T-chart as a beginning way to help learners organize their thoughts. Learning English, it's not hard to, it's hard to. You can use a table to collect and compare data. This is a great site. On this slide, it's a site that compares any major city in the world for cost of living around these items. So learners could actually look up some of this information. They could predict the information. At the higher level, they could read about it and fill it in. This would also be comparison perhaps between their hometown and where they're living now. You want to make use of a timeline. Timelines are fantastic, not just to teach grammar, but they're wonderful for helping learners understand what's happening in a story. Not all narratives are linear. So it really helps for learners when they're reading in preparation for their writing to see the difference between a linear tale and a less than linear tale or a more circular tale. And certainly with some of our learners' backgrounds, if they are writers, they have maybe written in a more circuitous style, and so it would be good for them to be able to analyze their own writing in this way. And it doesn't have to be a timeline per se, it can be sequential, first, second, third. The bottom line is you want to use a variety of graphic organizers. This is what, at the beginning level through the advanced level, will help learners begin to plan their writing. And we know from the evidence that when learners plan the writing, the drafting is easier. Another tool that moves us from pre-writing to drafting is using models and frames, and obviously not this model nor this frame. Here's a model. Take a moment and read it. I'll give you 10 seconds to read it. So I want my learners to write an email to their supervisor saying why they need some time off. Now, this is certainly more advanced than I would have my low beginners do, but showing this model, reading through this model, checking learners' comprehension. I'm going to ask questions such as, is this email from Jay Santos? What is the purpose of the email? How many days will the worker be off? So I'm going to use what they're going to write, the task that they're going to do. I'm going to use that as their writing task. Their reading task as well. And I'm going to have them read closely, which is a good college and career readiness skill. I'm going to have them read closely and read multiple times, because that same concept of revisiting is going to be part of the writing process as well. Then I'm going to have them analyze the organization. So show them where the subject is, the greeting, the request, the reason for the request, additional info, and the closing, as well as the signature. So I'm going to really explicitly show how this email is put together. And then I want to highlight formulaic phrases. So again, I'm coming back to my vocabulary, but I'm using the model to help me do that. And then I white out, but I might ask them to do that. That would be more ideal. Have them white out all but the most important information, so they can see maybe this writer was verbose. Maybe they could write it in a more concise fashion. The essay book is a wonderful resource for models. Now, the essay book does not monkey with the learner's writing in terms of the comprehensibility. If it's comprehensible, then it gets published. In some cases, there are grammar errors or word choice errors that you wouldn't want to use as your model, but it would be perfectly fine to show the learners the essay and have them read it. But then you'd also, when you're using the model, you'd want to make the changes that I've shown here in blue, because you do want the learner, if they're using the model, using it as a frame, they want to make use of that grammar and be more accurate. I can take that model apart, much in the same way that I took the model apart with A, B, C, D, E, but in this case, I'm using questions to help guide the learner's writing. And at the lower level, those questions are expanding questions that I might use if I had a higher level learner. Then I can take that model and I create a frame for the learner. This isn't what the learner would submit for the essay contest. This is the work that they're doing to prepare for writing their essay, because eventually you would want them to be able to write, to take off the training wheels, essentially. But there's nothing wrong with following this process and giving the learner lots of practice, especially at the low levels. And this was very impressive, because this gentleman was a beginning level learner. Here's a model for a much higher level learner, and this is about the differences between two countries. I went through and highlighted in different colors things that I'd want to point out to the students, or things I'd want to ask questions about. Notice that in addition, the opportunities to work, this is on the third paragraph, the opportunities to work and to study in Columbia are limited for the money that you have. This is actually an incorrect word choice, but I would want to ask the students about that and how they might change it. I highlighted and underlined in black those items that were expressions that the students would want to make use of. So we've done models and frames. We've done a lot of pre-writing. Now it's time to write. When do we write? What's your thinking about that? How best to write? Yes, it's another poll, but I believe it's your last one. Let's see. Yes, this is your last poll. So for the last poll, let's have a rousing 98%. Ready? How best to do writing in your sessions or for your learners? Excuse me. We have a very clear winner, but I'm not going to tell you what it is until we get a little higher in our voting. You've got 20 more seconds to post your vote. Please do. Three-quarters of you have voted. I can do the math. We're 30. That means, no, I can't do the math. That would have been a third. Okay, I can put 4 into 30. So that means about 20 of you have voted. Could I get those other 10? 9? All right. So are you surprised that so many people wanted to write over a period of several sessions? I'm not, because the writing process really lends itself to that. What does not lend itself to that is those of you that are not working in a one-to-one tutorial session, those of you that are working in classrooms that have open entry, open exit. And you need to figure out how you can have learners work with the material if they're going to show up 2 days after you've done the pre-writing. So this is a challenge, and it's a challenge that a lot of ESL instructors face. Sometimes what I've found works really well in those settings is if I can use a blended learning approach and have a way for the learners to pick up the pre-writing assignments before they come in. It's also possible to teach the writing lesson as a multi-level lesson and have some of the group working on the pre-writing while others are doing the writing. But I think it's important to see that most of you, it looks like most of you are having the writing happen in the session and over a period of sessions. We can't spend a whole lot of time on what's going on during the writing because that's really between the writer and his or her paper or tablet or laptop. Where we're going to go for the last part of our webinar is the feedback stage. And for many of us, this is the crisis moment. How can I possibly do writing? My learners are going to fill their paper with inaccurate statements, and I'm going to spend much of my natural life correcting. But I tell you that we can do it, and we can do it because we can approach it from a process and targeted instruction point of view. Oops. The feedback and editing stage, or working with the audience in mind, can take 3 steps. The first step is the reflection and self-editing stage. The second step is peer review and feedback. And the third step is tutor or instructor feedback. Now, these don't have to go in this order, but this is one way of introducing the learner to a more workplace type of writing situation. One of the things we know about self-monitoring and self-editing is that it leads to learning. So when you have students writing, first, give them samples of material to correct. have them start off before they ever do any writing at all. Maybe as part of your pre-writing, or maybe just an exercise following a grammar mini lesson, or as a starting point, as a little warm-up to your session. Give them a sample and have them go at it, either as individuals or as a team, and tell them there are X number of errors in this paragraph or in these 7 sentences. See how many of them you can find. Use editing checklists on their own writing. Give them a piece of paper that lets them look back and forth between what it is they're looking for in their paper and the errors they may have made. Have them do that as well with classmates' work. Have them do it with your work. If you're teaching and working in a tutorial setting, write something and exchange papers so that they're looking at yours and you're looking at theirs, so that gives them at least that peer feedback sense. This is great for auditory learners. It's probably a little more effective at the higher levels, but I have had beginning level learners do this as well. Have them use their cell phones. In my day, they didn't have cell phones, but have them use their cell phones and record themselves reading their writing. In some cases, they may hear the errors. Have them type their writing into a Word document. This is great for digital literacy. And actually, in a writing workshop that I did, this was the part that learners appreciated the most, having that opportunity. When you have an editing checklist, you want to make it very accessible to the author, and it could just be yes, no. It's the sort of thing that, if you just ask learners to check over their paper, they're not going to see whether they have errors or not. So you have to be very specific. This is in the handout, by the way. Everything in any of the student tools that I'm showing are in the handout, and there is a handout. Nicole, did you want to tell people now, because we're at about 20, how to download the handout?
Yes. So if you'd like to download a handout, there's on your screen there should be a handout section. You press the plus button, and it should say webinarhandout.pdf, and you can click that and download it straight onto your computer.
And you may not want to do that right now this minute, but I just wanted to make sure that you know it's there, and when we say goodbye, if you haven't done it yet, you'd be able to have a little time to do that. Thanks, Nicole.
No problem.
Oops. So when you give the peers the feedback checklists, you want to make very sure that they're not writing on the paper that they have. You want them to be sure that they're writing on a separate piece of paper that can be clipped to their partner or their teammate's paper. And what I like to do now, and I did not do in this checklist, is have the learner write what line the problem is on, so that the learner can, when they get the feedback, the writer gets the feedback, he or she can locate that pretty quickly. I also like to add information about the content. We're not seeing that in these, but very often I have, what did you like best about what you read? In this case, because it's an email with an excuse, it's not really something where the content is going to be that exciting. So I'm not going to ask the learner to say, oh, what was the best idea in this email? But it could be that maybe they like a particular word or a turn of phrase. You want to make very sure that the directions are very clear. The learners, when they're working with peer editing, this is a trust issue. So you want to make very sure that everybody understands, and you want to put those instructions right up on the board or project them so that everybody understands what it is they're meant to do. In this case, you can see number 4, I put make a note of the line or parts of the paragraph that support your feedback. And then that number 5 is very important for being able to answer any questions that the writer might have. This is a very explicit editing process. So we've gone from the learner looking at the material to the peer looking at the material, and now to us. And I really, again, here's a quote that I thought would be very helpful. And the Highlands have a wonderful, wonderful book. There are a few people out there that have got some great material, and at the moment, there's a woman named Diane, and her name just went out of my head, which is very annoying, but Ferris, Dana Ferris is her name. She's also wonderful in terms of talking about correcting learner errors in writing. And so I highly recommend her work. But teachers do not give feedback in a vacuum, but create a context for their remarks, making use of what they know of the writer to create an interpersonal link and target feedback to their personality and needs. This is probably at the crux of how we need to give feedback. We need to target it. So if the task was to write a list, and we wanted the list to be numbered because it was a sequential process, and the learner didn't number the list, that would be something that we would focus on. If the learner misspelled a word, we might say, if it was a very critical word, check your spelling, but we wouldn't have to circle that word and say that it was misspelled. We want to target where the feedback is most valuable for that writing task. And again, whether it's going to be a publicly published or whether learners are going to be sharing it with each other, and it's more of a formative assessment process. When you provide feedback and you're being explicit, you're giving the learner the opportunity to see very specifically what he or she has done wrong and potentially learn from that. Unfortunately, the research says that learners are very likely to ignore any marks that we make on the paper. If we require them to go back and make a correction based on feedback that is maybe a symbol-based feedback, or we correct the first paragraph and the first sentence, and then the second paragraph or the second sentence we leave to the learner to correct, then there's potentially some growth. But you can write in the form for the student, and as I say, or only mark the first part and let them correct the second part. You can summarize their errors. Again, this relies on the learner being able to read your summary. You can mark in the margin to let the learner know, okay, X, there's an issue here. It's a verb tense issue and a word form issue. I think that's what W over F is. I may be forgetting. Yes, it really could be word choice too. You can underline or circle the error and not explain what the error is. This set of correction symbols is in the handout, but the issue that some people have with correction symbols is that it is another language for learners to have to use, another set of abbreviations. But that also is true for IPA. I mean, if this is something that helps the learners quickly recognize what the errors are and attend to them, it's very useful. Would I make use of all of these? Probably not, and certainly not on one paper. You can also assess learners' writing by using a rubric, and the rubric helps the learner understand the dimensions of writing. Now again, this is a little more complex than I would use with a beginning level learner, but I could certainly make a rubric that would be appropriate for beginning level, with the email, for example. But if you look at this, you can see that across the top, you have the dimensions of the writing, and down the side, you have a scale. And essentially, the scale is going to 3 is that the learner is doing it satisfactorily. But there could be areas. One of the nice things about a rubric is that there are areas of strength and weakness. So a student could have a 3 in content and organization and maybe a 1 in mechanics. And that would be something that would tell that learner, okay, this is where I need to focus. I need to, in my revision, this is what I need to focus on. I want to encourage you especially if you're in tutorial settings, to work with your learners, to write collaboratively with your learner. If you look at the website for the Florida Literacy Coalition, adult learners and their tutors or teachers are encouraged to work together in writing, typing, editing, and submitting a written piece. So this is an opportunity not for the learner to feel cast adrift, but for you to work together, providing providing word choice options, helping the learner see models that he or she can choose from for different ways that they want to express themselves in the essay. And if you are lucky enough to be teaching in well, I shouldn't say lucky enough, but it feels lucky sometimes with writing. If you're lucky enough to be teaching in a class where learners really enjoy writing and they enjoy each other, they have a strong community, then having them write some initial essays or summaries or descriptions, process paragraphs together, collaborating on that is very meaningful. And then the rubric is terrific because the team is scoring themselves or scoring their peers' work. The last stage of the writing process is publishing learners' work, and I'm not spending a lot of time today here on that, but you have an incredible opportunity to publish your learners' work. The call for essays for the Florida Adult Learner Essay Book has gone out. And remind me, Nicole, I didn't write the date here. I think you said January 25th. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. So those will be due in on January 25th, and that gives you a substantial amount of time to work with your learners. If you've started, terrific. If you haven't yet started, remember that it doesn't have to be a multi-paragraph essay. It can be a poem or a personal story. And if you're going to write over several sessions, that would give you the opportunity to have something ready by the 25th. If you want to take more time and you're not looking at the essay book as your end goal, I encourage you to make a plan of how you would publish something. It's terrific to do newsletters. Wikis are available. In the handout, I gave you a list of various resources for publishing. There are a number of and not news for you, but the Change Agent, which is put out by World Ed. There are a lot of places where learners can write letters. You could certainly have them. Sorry, guys. You can certainly have them post on blogs. There are a lot of places for learners to be able to put their writing that are much more available than they were in my day, she said creakily. I see that we have a question. We only meet twice a week, hard to write over several sessions. But Nancy, with writing, you can actually have them, if you meet twice a week, you can have them write for maybe 15 minutes, do your pre-writing in the first 2 sessions, do a series of pre-writing tasks, and then in the second week, have them start their drafting, and they can continue that drafting at home. If it's motivating enough, the learners will do that. One of the things to do is to make sure that initially the writing that you're asking them to do isn't so lengthy that they can't tackle it in that way. Using frames is also very helpful in that situation, so they're not having to write as much original material around their main content that's being supplied for them. So let's take a look at what we looked at today, and then I'll ask about questions. That's silly. So we discussed selecting meaningful writing topics and prompts, and the idea of applying the steps of the writing process to writing instruction. We developed a variety of pre-writing tasks that prepare learners to write, and we talked about using writing frames and models to guide the learner's writing. And last but certainly not least, we talked about the use of rubrics and checklists to help your learners and you assess their writing. So we have about 7 more minutes, and I am delighted because I really wanted there to be a question and answer period, so we have plenty of time for that. I am at your disposal. Type away. Okay, Krista is asking how to download the handout if you're listening on your phone. Nicole, will we just send that out, the handout out with the survey or the evaluation form?
Yes, I'll send the handout out to everyone. I don't think it's possible to download it on the phone, so I'll send that out along with our survey.
And Nancy, it's called webinarhandout.pdf. Nancy's wondering, once you have downloaded, how do you find it? The actual file had a different name, but it's now gotten quite concise, which is not bad. I'm hoping that there's a lot of typing going on. I cannot tell if there's any typing going on, and I certainly don't want to leave you with dead air. Let me ask you to post if you don't have a question. Oops, not yet. Oops, that wasn't meant to happen. Let me ask that if you don't have a question, you post in the question an answer to one of these questions that I have here, since we don't have a chat. If you could post, what's one idea you're taking away from our time together, or what's one idea or practice that you want to explore further? So if you would, please type that into the question area. Krista is asking if there are any books that I recommend for teaching writing. Keith Folse, the bibliography in the handout has a number of books. Keith Folse, who is a Florida fellow, I think out of Tampa. I should know that. He's probably going to be very annoyed with me. He has some wonderful, a wonderful series on writing. There's a great book out from Michigan Press, and because I don't have it in front of me, but that's also in the handout bibliography. One of my very favorite books of all time is the Multicultural Writer's Handbook. It's got tremendous, it's very creative as opposed to being highly college and career ready. It's Linda Blanton Lee, or Linda Blanton and Linda Lee, and I think there are 3 of them. You can only buy them used now, but they're just terrific. They have readings and then very specific strategies that help you examine how the author worked with the particular topic, and then opportunities to write. Terrific. I see that someone is taking away ideas, the idea of models and frames. I won't name you because you didn't know you're going to be named. Self-checklists and peer feedback are winners. Making lists and cards to develop their writing skills. Making writing frames for level 1 students. It's a great thing to do because it really clarifies, as instructors, it clarifies for us what's critical for that learner to be able to do on his or her own, and what support we can offer them in terms of the frame. Let me recommend, for those of you that are working hard to get your learners college and career ready, or just 21st century ready, Kate Kinsella, Kinsella, is wonderful. She has tremendous resources out there for academic writing for English ESL learners, for English language learners. And I see that one of the things to explore further is how to provide feedback that learners will heed. Such a good point. And in some ways, we can ask our learners what's most important to them too. When they look at an incorrect sample and they edit, we can ask them, which one of these errors is most important? Which one of these errors makes it difficult to understand? And help them understand the whole editing process. And I see that checklists are a takeaway. A lot of pre-writing, hooray. I see a lot of pre-writing. Terrific. And I see that for some of you, this was a great review. For some of you, there were some new ideas, and that delights me. Remember that when we tap into what the learner already knows, we are creating some element of relevance, but motivation comes from exploring things that are new and that are of high interest to the learner. So giving the learner a mix of opportunities where they're not just talking about their opinions, but they're bringing in information from other sources. That's a huge part of college and career readiness, the ability to research, and our learners are being asked to do that more and more on the job. The concept of research, I don't mean academic research, but going to find information, seeking out other information or facts. The references for Kate Kinsella, the question that Verna asks is whether the references are going to be added to the handout. Many of them are in there, but I will be sure to send the two that I mentioned, the Multicultural Writers workshop and Kate Kinsella. I'll be sure to send those to Nicole so she can get them in the email. Well, it looks to me like many of you are taking things away, which is very heartwarming. And what I'd like you to take away is my gratitude for your spending this time together with me. 90 minutes is a lot to take away from your time during the holidays, but your learners are very lucky, and it's been an honor to be able to spend the time with you. And I encourage you, my email is on that survey, so if you wanted to take the survey, that you're more than welcome to contact me by email, and I'm happy to answer questions. Nicole, I think that we are at our time.
Okay, thank you, Jamie, and thank you all for joining us today. Once again, if you're interested in looking at the essay book, you can visit our page at www.floridaliteracy.org. Thank you all and have a great holiday.
We had one question, Nicole. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Do they receive a certificate?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Do they receive a certificate? We got a question in the question pod about receiving
absolutely. Absolutely. In the survey, I'm going to include a section where you can put in your email address and your name. It's important that you put both your name and email address because I need to be able to contact you. So you can email me and I will give you a certificate saying that you completed 1.5 hours of professional development with us. Okay?
Perfect.
All right. Thank you guys for joining. Have a great day.